Once again, welcome back and thank you for rejoining for our concluding discussion to this year's Agricultural Symposium. As we wrap up this year's program, I want to offer, before sharing some concluding thoughts on this year's content, just a few comments as to why we host programs like this and why we engage with audiences as we do in programs like this. A regular part of our work at the Kansas City Fed has been and remains focused on agriculture. The region of the country that we serve has a high concentration in agriculture, and our bank's history of focusing on that sector of the economy has been something that's been important for us for a long time. So part of that focus requires ongoing monitoring of conditions and economic developments, of course, how that translates into any sorts of pressures or opportunities, risks that we want to be aware of, especially as it relates to things like lending and what that might mean, for example, for rural communities. So we track those developments on a regular basis. We're mindful of things such as the past year and the kind of impact that that's had on rural communities in the district that we serve, how it's affected agriculture, broadly defined. So when we say agriculture, we think about businesses, we think about producers, we think about communities, lenders, and many others that are affected by some of those conditions. At the same time, though, some of these developments happen amid an environment that has already underlying trends within it. And so it's important for us to occasionally step back from some of those day-to-day or month-to-month, sometimes even year-to-year type questions, and focus more on bigger picture issues that are likely to have significance over a longer time horizon. So in programs like this, where we put together a program where we invite experts and other speakers to share their thoughts, it gives us the opportunity to step back from some of those regular developments and focus a little bit more on, again, some of those things that may be significant over a 5-year, 10-year time horizon, maybe even longer. This was a program that we did for the first time virtually this year, and part of our goal in hosting this program is to be able to connect with people. That's an important part of how we gather input as it relates to developments in agriculture, other industries that may depend on agricultural production or the services that are provided by it. So we do look forward to being able to engage with you again in the future, hopefully in person. That does give us an opportunity, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, to be able to interact, for example, during breaks and side conversations where a lot of times some of that input seems to flow maybe most generally. So we appreciate the opportunity to be able to learn from each other, to be able to learn from the questions that are asked. For example, we do learn from the experts that are sharing their thoughts on the panels in the sessions, of course, the keynote speakers as well. Gives us the opportunity to develop a broader understanding of the issues that we'd want to be aware of. And so we look forward to be able to engage with you and learn from all of you as we continue these kinds of programs. In wrapping up this year's program, though, I want to first share the results of our polling questions that we've asked during the past 2 days. I will keep my comments relatively brief, but before getting into some of the polling questions, I'd like to begin just by offering a little bit more context about why we chose this topic of productivity growth to begin with. Now, again, as I mentioned in my comments yesterday, for those that were able to tune in, we began talking about the topic of productivity growth actually well in advance of the pandemic. And this underscores my comment just a moment ago that we're often seeking to better understand the underlying trends and drivers in the economy that we think are shaping markets over a longer time horizon, even though sometimes the structure of those markets might be impacted from one month to another or 1 year to another on the basis of current developments. So one of the primary reasons, though, that we decided to focus on productivity growth, I would argue, is that productivity is a primary determinant, first and foremost, of agricultural prices. We've heard that come out in a lot of different ways yesterday and today, and I'll get into some of that in just a moment. But to understand how agricultural prices will evolve in the future, we do need to understand what that path of productivity looks like. And in some ways, when we ask about the importance of productivity, it's almost akin to asking about the importance of agricultural prices. And so to offer just a little bit of context on this too, and I'll use this as a way to motivate some of the conversation that we want to talk about and have been talking about the past 2 days as it relates to productivity. I'll take people back first to the end of 2004. And if you've followed agriculture at that time, we talk about corn as a major commodity in the United States. It clearly can have correlation, as was described in some of the presentations even here this morning, with soybeans and wheat and other major commodities. But if we think about corn specifically, just as one of those major commodities that we often reference in agriculture, At the end of 2004, the price of corn was just under $2 per bushel, and many people in the sector will remember the years in agriculture, for example, in the 1990s, when prices had been relatively low for a long period of time and didn't really move around very much. By the beginning of 2007, that price of corn had roughly doubled from less than $2 per bushel to just over $3.50, maybe $3.75 per bushel in January of 2007. By mid-2008, those corn prices had touched somewhere north of $7 per bushel. And so again, in a span of just 4 years, we went from less than $2 to something more than $7. From 2008 to 2013, approximately, those prices remained elevated, relatively high. Many in the sector will have remembered this time as a boom year for agriculture. A lot of farmers would have seen record farm income during that time. Many other industries affected in a different way with some of those high prices. As we began 2020, there was an expectation perhaps that some of those low commodity prices would persist, and that was building off of 6 to 7 years already of commodity prices being relatively low. But now we're once again in an environment where corn prices, again, just to give a very specific example, have further increased to the point of being around $7 per bushel. So why does all of this matter, and why do I highlight this as a development as it relates to prices? And I'll try to tie this into productivity specifically. One of the things that this points to is that there are cycles that happen in agriculture, even though they may occur amid underlying trends that we think are still broadly important. And the duration and severity of these cycles, I would argue, depends crucially on productivity in an environment that we always know will contain risks to varying degrees. So, for example, we often get questions, even today now, 4 decades later, about the 1980s and how that particular time in agriculture had affected the business of agriculture, the business of farming, how it affected rural communities. That was a time where many people will recall there was a shock that affected increased demand for agricultural exports, ultimately led to a rapid increase in agricultural prices. And as a result, as we've typically seen in the past, the sector responds by increasing production, finding new and better ways of producing a product that ultimately brings prices back to a point that may be more long-run sustainable or ultimately relieves some of that pressure on the end users of that product. But in the case of the 1980s, one of the things that had happened was that production responded very quickly over the span of a couple of years and created a lot of pressures in the ag economy. As we look at the environment now in the more recent time period, say from 2004 to 2008, and then to 2013, and now more recently what we're looking at in 2021, what we see is a constant source of shocks that affect the economy, and productivity being a key as to how those shocks play out. So a year ago, when we were perhaps a bit worried about some of the risks in agriculture that might emerge from a long and gradual but prolonged environment of a downturn in agriculture, what that might mean for a number of different things, what it might mean for incomes in the farm sector and ultimately financial pressure that might be generated from that. How do lenders respond alongside some of those pressures? How do we think, for example, about the livelihood of rural communities, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world, as we've heard throughout the past 2 days, that are also exposed, for example, to low commodity prices? For a number of years, we had already been experiencing migration from rural counties, for example, to urban counties, and seeing that play out also on a global scale. So productivity and the ability to respond to those shocks as they emerge, and to a certain extent recognize what some of the risks are and mitigate those risks, I think will be an important determinant to how we think about commodity prices going forward, how we think about profitability of farms, but also businesses that are then connected to those farms and services that also provide specific sorts of benefits to farming operations, recognizing that production. The first question that we asked attendees in this year's program was simply whether or not you thought agricultural productivity growth would be faster or slower than the general economy in the years coming. And 59% of you thought that productivity growth in agriculture would be faster. So what are the implications if that actually did play out, if we saw that agricultural productivity growth would be faster than the broader economy? So one of the first things, again, is to think about the implication for prices. If we do find better and maybe more sustainable ways to produce agricultural products over that time period, that likely will result in prices being lower. If we continue to think about what that might mean, it means that areas that have the strongest potential for productivity gains, those areas of the world that are well positioned to continue production and already have been for the past number of years, are generally best positioned to see the benefits of that increased productivity. Whereas those locations that maybe don't have the strongest potential for production would see challenges that emerge from a lower commodity price and a price environment that ultimately translates into reduced income. And again, thinking about pressure in those areas. So there are likely to be benefits and also drawbacks associated with some of that productivity. And again, the path of that productivity, I think, matters as it relates to the formulation of prices and how those markets are going to be structured. It's not just a matter, though, of how fast or how slow those productivity gains are, but maybe also why and how. The fluctuations in the productivity growth will matter because, again, we've experienced cycles in agriculture in the past. The ability of this sector to respond and how quick it's able to respond to what definitely will be emerging risks. We will see risks different than we've seen risks in the past. And if anything, the past year has taught us that we will see risks that we've not seen before. So productivity, an important component to that. We asked all of you in the second polling question yesterday to consider what is the biggest risk to productivity growth in agriculture over the next 10 years. A third of those that responded to this question indicated that farm income, profitability, and ag prices would be the biggest risk. So let me offer just a quick thought on this. In the same way that productivity growth can affect farm income by affecting prices, individual producers are needing to make investment decisions that ultimately will have an impact on productivity itself in the future. And so for businesses, for producers in a certain area, in a certain part of the world, maybe even in a specific industry, as they assess the future prospects for farm income, they will make decisions about how to expand an operation, about what sorts of new changes to implement on a farm. We heard yesterday, for example, how to resolve labor shortages. That will be an ongoing conversation. And all of those things ultimately will have, I think, an effect on productivity. And so a third of our respondents to that survey question indicated that farm income and profits, ag prices, would be an important determinant. Not a result of productivity, but a determinant of productivity. Another third indicated that policy developments or geopolitical risks are likely to be the most significant risk. This would be an example of factors that are generally outside the control of producers and can result in potentially unforeseen effects on productivity. We could look at events of the past year in a number of different ways and put this into the category of developments that are outside of the control of producers, and ultimately producers needing to respond to that, the sector needing to respond, but still having an impact on productivity. 16% of you had indicated environmental risks would be the most significant, and another 13% indicated labor shortages, which that's partly also, I'm sure, dependent on where you're located in terms of region. Yesterday, we heard a lot about how research, technology, and data are likely to be well positioned to solve problems and mitigate some of these risks. So we sought to describe what the impact, for example, of private sector research might look like and what public sector research looks like, how data and technology and what types of technology might be best positioned to address any of those problems that ultimately is what leads to increases in productivity gains through innovation. The adoption of new technologies and what sorts of technologies might be most relevant going forward, how we use data will be an important part of that. But at the same time, recognizing that all of these platforms, all of these resources still need to be able to talk to each other. Producers need to be able to have ways of having these platforms be interoperable among the different options. And so that might also vary by size of operation. We heard a little bit more yesterday about how some large farms may be positioned differently to take on some of this technology. But at the same time, smaller operations need a different kind of resource, and that generally speaking, a healthy agricultural economy will have ways in which all of those actors can participate together and leverage the resources that might be available. Our program today then sought to identify ways in which agricultural productivity is linked to other industries in the supply chain and how productivity may then relate, for example, to environmental factors. The first polling question that we asked this morning was, which industry will see the strongest gains in agricultural productivity growth over the next 10 years? And here we saw about 40% of our respondents had indicated crops, and another 40% had indicated fruits, vegetables, or other specialty products. Far fewer of our respondents indicated livestock or other sorts of industries that are likely to see the gains in productivity. I think this is an important observation because we do know that some industries have already seen more significant gains in productivity, and there will be differences across regions. In just the past 2 decades, if we look at corn yields, for example, in the United States, and this was a topic of conversation among the participants in the question and answer period of our meeting the past couple of days, we look at corn yields and we see that over the past 2 decades, a 35% increase, but 115% increase in Brazil. Those increases have been far less in places like Africa, and recognizing that there have been disparities that have come about simply because of differences in crop practices and just generally infrastructure and other sorts of things across regions. So we know that there's large increases in productivity in certain segments of agriculture. I mentioned corn just as one example. We know that technological advancements have also impacted productivity in other parts of agriculture. And we heard from some speakers today, for example, Jim Pillen referencing this morning, the increase in hog production that's come about just in the past several decades that is really about a 3-fold increase per sow that they had on their farm. And again, just highlighting another place where we've seen some tremendous increases in productivity that's had a lot of implications in terms of what that's meant, not just for farmers and those involved in the industry, but those that are also end users of those products and consumers as well. We also asked in our final polling question for you to indicate the most prevalent environmental risk to agricultural production in your current location. And this was also an interesting response because about half of respondents noted that drought and water availability was the most significant environmental risk, and another 34% that highlighted extreme or highly variable weather events being most important. And so our speakers later this morning touched on how some of those aspects are likely to affect productivity, maybe even differently than what might have been expected, say, 10 or 15 years ago, and recognizing that will be another area of research that's needed to try to explore some of the implications. So pulling all of this back together, we chose the topic of agricultural productivity growth for a lot of different reasons, but one of the main ones being because it's really kind of that key between thinking about how demand for agricultural products is evolving and ultimately how producers, how production and supply is positioned, recognizing any potential resource constraints and risks that might emerge over time. So we had some discussion the last 2 days about food security. And the reason for that is ultimately to try to recognize not just thinking about the farm sector and businesses that are attached to farming, which of course are significant in how we think about the state of our economy in the 7-state region that we cover at the Kansas City Fed. But again, how that also plays out for households and consumers in our region, yes, but also across the globe. And so it's important to recognize, again, as we assess events of the past year and what that's meant for food security, access to food, that's an important part of how we think about households engaging in the economy in the same way that we think about the importance of investments and business also being something that we want to focus on when we assess the relative strength of the economy here in the Kansas City Fed region, or even nationally and globally for that matter. So we chose the title of this year's program to be The Roots of Agricultural Productivity Growth. We wanted to be able to hear from experts about the components that are affecting productivity and how those components are likely to evolve in the future. In other words, really, what factors are shaping the roots of agricultural productivity? But at the same time, we know that there will be significant implications associated with that future path of productivity in much the same way that the output of plants, to give an example, is very much dependent on the strength of its roots. And so that's why we wanted to talk about the productivity growth and its path in the future, because we feel as though how that plays out in the next 10 years, 20 years, and beyond ultimately will shape that linkage between demand growth and supply, and then what that means for prices and communities and businesses that depend on those prices for profits and other opportunities. Part of our mission at the Kansas City Fed is to be a resource for information that might be useful for business and community leaders, for policymakers, and the general public. And again, a big part of this program is to give us the opportunity to engage with all of you, to hear what questions you might have. Those questions are informative to help us think a little bit more about the topics that we want to spend more time on in the future. And as we engage with you in the future, our hope is to be able to continue that conversation. And so to this end, I do hope that you've enjoyed our Agricultural Symposium this year. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. We appreciate any of the responses to the quick polls that we highlighted here in this wrap-up discussion following the main sessions yesterday and today as well for an evaluation of those sessions. Please also watch for an email in the coming days with a link to an electronic evaluation. I would note that all of the resources from this year's Agricultural Symposium are available online. For those of you that were not able to watch yesterday's broadcast, that will also be available in its entirety, so you're welcome to go back and revisit some of the points that may have come out yesterday or the rest of the program as that is available. We'd encourage you to please visit kansascityfed.org/agriculture to find additional research and analysis on the agricultural economy. And once again, understanding agriculture and for us, the institutions that it touches, which is really quite vast, is important to the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and particularly as circumstances evolve, this has never been more true than it has been the past year, creating either new or different market realities, opportunities, and potentially also weaknesses that we want to be cognizant of in the time ahead. We are committed to studying trends in agricultural and rural places, and we do appreciate your participation in this year's virtual symposium. With that, I thank you all again once more for attending, and for this year, the symposium is adjourned.